Over the years, a lot of wrestlers have been cut from WWE, with the reasons for this ranging from backstage issues to lack of creative or even the dreaded budget cuts. But just because someone's been fired, it doesn't mean they can't be rehired again. No, there are almost as many examples of this too as it happens, and it's those wrestlers who were let go then brought back into the fold that we're going to be looking at right now, starting with our first entry, Rusev. Yes, after first breaking out on the WWE scene during the mid-2010s with his Bulgarian Brute gimmick, Rusev became a quick smash with fans. And that support he had only continued to get stronger when, later on down the line, he turned babyface and developed the Rusev Day gimmick. Obviously then, you'd have been forgiven for thinking there were points where he was going to be a main event force in Vince McMahon's company, so over was he getting with live crowds. Sadly though, this would not be enough to keep him in the company as the 2020s were arriving. No, it would be in April of that year that the Plovdiv native would be cut from his contract along with a number of other performers, including his wife Lana. Where would he go from there? Well, 90 days later, the big man would find himself landing on his feet, as at this point he'd debut with All Elite Wrestling, with him now working under his real name of Miro. But while the initial belief was that Miro was going to have a lot more success in AEW, in the end, this was not the case, as one great run as TNT champion aside, he was barely even there. So it was then that for over a year, Miro would be sitting on the bench before he was finally granted his release in February of 2025 after having requested it previously. And luckily for him, when this happened, WWE were only too happy to welcome him back into the fold as, on the April 21st episode of Raw, Rusev returned to WWE, with it being the red brand he remains on as of the time of this video's recording. Sure, he hasn't been able to rise to the level that he was at during his peak days in the 2010s again. Rather, he's currently in the mid-card on Monday nights battling the likes of Sheamus. But that could all change as time goes on. And he's not the only person who was cut from WWE and from there went to AEW and back again to WWE. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Andrade. What was Andrade's first WWE run like back during the mid to late 2010s? Well, it would be pretty similar to Rusev's in that it would see him get over at various points but never be used to the fullest of his potential. No, rather than becoming the star he could have become, the Durango native ultimately fell into that mid-card utility player role. So it must have seemed like a blessing in disguise for him then when, in March of 2021, he was granted his release, with this being something he'd requested some time prior. And we all know what happened after that. Andrade arrived in AEW soon thereafter, and from there went on to have a decent run. Yes, he was never a main eventer or anything, but he was a solid hand and someone who shone during things like the inaugural Continental Classic. Once his contract ran out with All Elite Wrestling in December of 2023, however, he'd decide to go back to WWE, with part of the reason for this being he preferred being booked by Triple H, and another part being that it was there that his then wife, Charlotte Flair, was working. What happened from here? Well, unfortunately, not a lot. No, despite having a lot of buzz upon reappearing in WWE, Andrade suffered the same fate as Rusev in the sense that he quickly fell into being a mid-card player who was never really given much to do. Yes, it felt like he'd gone back to square one again after finding the same fate befalling him in both his first run with WWE and his run with AEW. And he'd continue to remain in that spot all the way up until September of 2025, at which point he was fired again, and from there became the first person to go from WWE to AEW to WWE and back to AEW again. Or at least it seemed this was going to be the case. As he'd soon learn, however, apparently he had a no-compete clause in his contract, despite being fired. And this meant when he showed up on the October 1st, 2025 episode of Dynamite to attack Kenny Omega, TKO would inform him that as he had broken this non-compete, he was now not allowed to wrestle anywhere for a full year. What'll he do from here? Well, that remains to be seen. One thing we probably won't be seeing him doing anytime soon, though, is return to WWE for a third time. And that means he likely won't get a chance to revive that old rivalry from both NXT and AEW with our next subject, Alistair Black. That's right, following the same career path as both Rusev and Andrade, Alistair Black was considered a big-time rising star within WWE during the mid-2010s, with his run down on NXT getting him very over and even seeing him become a world champion at one point. Sadly though, once he was called up to the main roster in February of 2019, it quickly became apparent Vince McMahon didn't get him. And so because of that, the Amsterdam-born star began to falter, to the point that by June of 2021, he'd be getting cut from his contract as part of another wave of mass releases. Where did he go from there? Well, to AEW. And a lot quicker than people expected because, due to a technicality in his contract which hadn't been updated from his days in NXT, Black had a 30-day non-compete instead of a 90-day one, with this allowing him to appear on Dynamite as soon as July. But while he had a strong start there during a main event level program with Cody Rhodes, after that the now renamed Malachi Black would pretty much only be used as a trios act alongside his House of Black stablemates Brody King and Buddy Matthews. Sure, he would find some success as part of this group, with him notably becoming a trios champion at one point and even getting to defend those belts at Wembley Stadium in the summer of 2023. But as far as the singles run was concerned, that just never materialized. So once his contract expired in February of 2025, he and AEW would part ways. But the former NXT champion wouldn't be out of the public eye for long. No, a couple of months later he'd be re-debuting for WWE, with him now being exclusive to the SmackDown brand. And while there was a ropey first few months of him getting settled in there, he's since found himself climbing the card to the point that he recently got to have a WWE title match with his old Jacksonville rival, Cody Rhodes. Yes, it looks like for the first time, Alistair Black might be getting used to the fullest of his potential on the main roster. And if the stars align in the right way, this could even lead to him one day winning that WWE title from the American Nightmare. Even if he doesn't though, the Dark Father will no doubt be content knowing that he's getting a better run in WWE than he did the first time around. And this time, he's even getting to do it with his wife, as she's recently become a part of his whole on-screen act. Who are we talking about here? Why, someone who also happens to be our next subject, a woman who got fired and rehired by WWE too, a woman known to wrestling fans as Zelina Vega. Now this one is an interesting one because Zelina Vega's initial release from WWE did not follow the same pattern as so many others we're looking at today. No, hers was a unique case in many ways. And it all started when, after years of spending most of her time in WWE acting as a valet to Andrade, she'd find herself growing frustrated with her lack of opportunities. Where would things go from there? Well, in a pretty bitter direction as it happened, because after being told she was being cut from her contract on November 13th, 2020, Zelina would make her feelings clear when she tweeted out her support of wrestlers forming a union so as to be better represented when it came to things like contracts. Needless to say then, it seemed like this was her burning a bridge with her now former employer, and at the same time it also seemed to give AEW pause about bringing her in, as even though her husband was working there at the time, Vega never appeared there. No, she'd instead sit on ice for the next 8 months, doing nothing and giving everyone the impression that she was now done with the industry for good. That was until she wasn't, because it would be in July of 2021 that, after apparently mending fences with WWE, the Queen's Native would be rehired by WWE, with her this time coming in as more of a wrestler than a valet. And that worked out well for her, as by the time the year was over she'd be winning the Women's King of the Ring. Hell, she'd also become a women's tag team champion alongside Carmella, with this being the highlight of her career up until things took another turn again a few months later when she joined the Latino World Order and there eventually won the Women's United States title, her first ever singles gold. Of course, as things stand today though, Zelina is no longer Women's United States champion, and she's no longer part of the Latino World Order either. Rather, she's now aligned herself with her real-life husband, Alistair Black. Where will this take her? Well, that remains to be seen. But one thing is for sure, she must be thankful that she got a second chance with WWE in 2021, as had that not happened, then the wrestling fanbase might never have heard from her again. But what of another woman in the WWE system? Someone who's a close real-life friend of Zelina Vega's. Wasn't she also cut from her WWE contract at one point, only to then be rehired again later on down the line? Why, yes she was, and that's exactly why she's our next subject, the one, the only, Dakota Kai. Yes, here's someone who first broke out in the WWE system while being a part of NXT during the mid to late 2010s. Unlike Zelina Vega, however, who spent her time in developmental working as the business manager to Andrade, Dakota Kai would get over as an in-ring performer primarily, first as a babyface act alongside her tag team partner Tegan Nox, and then as a heel who was able to win tag team gold with Raquel Rodriguez. Ultimately though, well, the hope was that as the summer of 2022 was approaching, the New Zealand native would be getting a main roster call-up. Once it became clear this was not going to be the case, Kai informed the company that she would not be renewing her contract when it came up soon thereafter. So in response to this, she was cut from this contract in April of that year, at which point the former tag team champion was left to go find work elsewhere. But while initially many assumed it would be AEW she'd go to, in the end she would not do this, as at SummerSlam a few months later, she'd returned to WWE to form Damage Control alongside Bayley and Io Sky. Why was Dakota now suddenly getting a main roster push when there hadn't been plans for this before? Well, because now Triple H would be the one in charge of booking the show, as Vince McMahon had been ousted for the first time. And because Triple H was now the one booking the show, the Auckland-born star would continue to maintain a prominent presence on WWE for the next few years, as Damage Control eventually expanded to include the likes of Asuka and Kairi Sane. Sure, injuries would hamper much of her run here, but whenever she was around, she was at least able to get on TV. Sadly though, this second run would also come to an end when on May 2nd, 2025, Dakota Kai was released by WWE for a second time in 3 years, with this one seeming to be her last run as far as things look at the moment. That's right, there's currently no indication that Kai will be going back to WWE in the near future. Obviously then, the hope is that this situation will change for her eventually, with one of the big companies deciding to take another look at her and offer her a contract. But let's move away from her for now and back over to the men's division again, as there we'll find another example of someone who was fired, rehired, and then fired again by WWE. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Samoa Joe. Now here's an example of someone who seemed like a can't miss, because whether it was his time in Ring of Honor where he held that company's world title for a total of 645 days between March of 2003 and December of 2004, or his lengthy run in TNA where he established himself as a pillar of the promotion along with AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels, there was a very solid argument to be made that during the 2000s and into the 2010s, Samoa Joe was the best wrestler in the world. Obviously then, this made everyone assume he'd at some point find his way over to WWE, and that would eventually happen when, in 2015, he arrived in NXT and there became a 2-time world champion. What happened after that? Well, Joe would have a run on the main roster too. Unfortunately though, this run would not be booked so well, as that one Brock Lesnar feud aside, the big man really did nothing of note. And that all led to a situation where, after a concussion saw him spend a period of time behind the commentary booth instead of in the ring, he'd be cut from his contract in April of 2021 as part of the same wave of mass releases, which eventually saw Alistair Black get fired too. But while this must have initially got people over in AEW talking as they wanted to sign the Samoan submission machine to a contract, Triple H was quick enough on the ball that just 2 months later, he'd be able to override Vince McMahon's main roster decision by hiring Joe to come back as an exclusive member of the NXT roster again. But alas, even this wouldn't work out in the San Francisco native's favor, as immediately after winning the NXT World title for a third time, the Game would be ousted from his role as booker of the developmental brand, as Vince McMahon and Bruce Pritchard began the process of transforming it into 2.0. And once that happened, there was no more place for the Samoan submission machine down in Florida, with this meaning he'd be fired for the second time in the space of a year before he could even make one defense as world champion. Thankfully though, since then Joe has fallen on his feet by moving over to AEW, where he's become a 1-time men's world champion, 2-time TNT champion, and 1/3 of the current trios champions. And given he appears to be ending his in-ring career down in Jacksonville now, it looks like we are not going to get a rematch between him and the man who he beat to win that 3rd NXT title, our next subject, Karrion Kross, along with his valet, Scarlett. Yes, Karrion Kross and Scarlett are 2 other notable figures who have been in and out of WWE over the years. And for them, it all began in the spring of 2020. That was the point with that, fresh off a run with Impact Wrestling where they'd worked under their original names of Killer Kross and Scarlett Bordeaux, the real-life couple made the jump over to Florida to become part of the NXT roster. And given both had the exact looks WWE were going for here, with Kross having a Dave Bautista-esque physique and Bordeaux looking like the second coming of Sable, it was a no-brainer that they'd be rocketed all the way up to the top. As come mid-2021, the big man would be a 2-time NXT World Champion. So given the success the pair had achieved already, surely the inevitable main roster run would be a slam dunk win for them, right? Well, wrong. Because in one of the most baffling booking decisions from late-stage Vince McMahon, he chose to strip Karrion Kross of everything about him, which was cool when he brought him up to Raw soon thereafter. And that meant no more badass entrance, no Scarlett by his side, and rather than his previous look, he'd now sport a bizarre Roman gladiator garb. Understandably then, this new repackaging did not get over with fans, and it pretty quickly led to the New York native getting released from his contract during the next wave of budget cuts. And with him now gone, that meant there was no longer a place for Scarlett Bordeaux anymore either, which was why she'd get cut too. How did the pair bounce back after this? Well, after spending a brief period working in places like Major League Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling's American branch, New Japan Strong, Kross and Scarlett would get rehired by WWE in 2022 after Triple H took over as head of creative. Sadly though, while they were now back in the system, this wouldn't lead to the former two-time NXT World Champion and his valet rocketing up the card in WWE. No, for the next couple of years, they'd pretty much be stuck in mid-card hell, with the most notable thing they did being when Kross tried to do a modern take on Sean O'Hare's old Devil's Advocate character for a while. And while this would see him gain something of a cult following online, that wasn't enough to get him a good enough offer when, once he and Scarlett's contracts ran out in August of 2025, they were not able to come to terms for a new one. Yes, after apparently having contract negotiation issues with TKO, Karrion Kross and Scarlett Bordeaux decided not to re-sign here. And this means that as things stand today, they're once again back on the indies. Will they make it back to TV again in the future? It's entirely possible. Who knows? Maybe they'll sign with TNA. That would offer them an opportunity to get back on WWE TV again through the back door of NXT. Of course, if this happens, they might then get a chance to interact with our next subject again, someone else who's come and gone and then come back to WWE, Chelsea Green. Forgotten about Chelsea Green's initial run with WWE back in the late 2010s? That's okay, it wasn't exactly a memorable one. And the reason for that had little to do with the British Columbia native herself. Rather, the two-time Women's United States Champion's initial go-round in WWE would be severely hampered by a number of unfortunate injuries she picked up while on both NXT and, briefly, SmackDown. So because of that then, it was near impossible for her to build up any momentum. And when it came time for more cuts to occur in April of 2021, she'd find herself on the chopping block and left to go look elsewhere for work. Where would Chelsea go at this point? Well, back to TNA for a while, where she worked alongside her real-life husband, someone we'll get to in a moment. And after building herself back up there and even becoming a Knockouts World Tag Team Champion for a while alongside Deonna Purrazzo, a second opportunity in WWE would finally arise in early 2023, not long after Triple H had taken over the book. That's right, like with so many others we've looked at today already, it was the game's rise to power which allowed Green to re-enter the WWE system. And it's just as well it did because as things stand today, she's one of the more entertaining things about WWE with her comedic Karen character. So entertaining has she been since returning to WWE. In fact, it's been here that she's won multiple pieces of gold, including the aforementioned Women's United States title, the Women's Tag Team titles, and even the AAA World Mixed Tag Team titles. And this all suggests she's going to be in the company for a long time to come yet as the ultimate utility player. But what of that other half of hers we alluded to a moment ago? Doesn't he deserve a spot in this video as well? Well, as of the most recent episode of SmackDown, he does, because that's when we got the return of Zack Ryder. Okay, this one has been a long time coming for fans of Long Island Ice Z, because back during his initial run in WWE between 2007 and 2020, he got over as a major cult figure, with him at times being one of the most over people on the show. That said, the levels of success he was able to reach here never matched the level of popularity he had. No, aside from a single WrestleMania moment where he won the Intercontinental title for one night, there wasn't a great deal to write home about in terms of accolades on his part. And that meant when the lockdown happened in 2020 and WWE were making cuts, his name ended up on the chopping block, something which would see him, like with Chelsea Green, also be forced to go back out on the indies in order to make a living. But in the case of the man now going by his shoot name of Matt Cardona, this ended up being the best thing for him because over the next few years he'd built up a reputation for himself as the king of the indies, someone who could appear in any given promotion at any given time. Hell, during the first half of the 2020s, he appeared in places as far and wide as Game Changer Wrestling, Major League Wrestling, the National Wrestling Alliance, Ring of Honor, and TNA. And at one point he'd even get a cameo spot in AEW for a couple of weeks too. So with his reputation constantly growing, the question was always, would he ever make a return to WWE? As time went on and this didn't happen, however, people began to wonder if we'd ever get Zack Ryder back in his original home. But at last, this would happen on the November 14th, 2025 episode of SmackDown, as it was here the New York native returned as a surprise entrant in the John Cena The Last Time Is Now tournament. Does this mean Cardona will be sticking around for the long haul? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. If he does, then he might even get to lock horns with our next subject, the man known to wrestling fans as Bo Dallas. Yes, way before he was playing the role of the mysterious Uncle Howdy, Bo Dallas had a whole first run in WWE during the 2010s, a run which saw him go from being a delusional babyface world champion down in NXT, all the way to being a social outcast jobber on the main roster. And it was the fact he'd reached jobber status toward the end of the decade that made it easier for Vince McMahon to cut him from his contract in April of 2021. Of course, as we all know now, though, this wouldn't be the end of Dallas in the company forever, and the person we can thank the most for that is his late brother, Bray Wyatt. Why is this? Well, it was after Bray himself got cut and returned again in 2022 that he created an all-new character, that of a man being haunted by a strange figure known only as Uncle Howdy. And playing the role of Uncle Howdy would be none other than Taylor Rotunda. Unfortunately, though, before this story could reach its end, Bray would leave us abruptly in August of 2023, and so because of that, the angle would be dropped. What happened next then? Well, after taking some time away to grieve and to reformulate who he was in the ring, Bo Dallas would return in June of 2024 as Uncle Howdy, with him this time leading a group of outcasts known as the Wyatt Six, who were all acting in honor of the fallen Eater of Worlds. Really then, of all the WWE firings and returns, this is probably the most emotional for obvious reasons. The only negative we could say about it, in fact, would be the fact that the Wyatt Six didn't include our next subject, someone else who had close ties to Bray Wyatt over the years, another man who has been in and out of the company himself as it happens. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Braun Strowman? Now, there was a period of time where it would have seemed unthinkable that WWE would ever release Braun Strowman as, with his mammoth size and over character, he was everything the company were looking for in a star. Hell, when Roman Reigns pulled out of WrestleMania 36 at the last minute over health concerns, it would be the big man who Vince McMahon trusted enough to step in his place and win the Universal title from Goldberg. But alas, by the time we got to June of 2021, even the monster among men wouldn't be spared when the dreaded budget cuts came around. What would this mean for Braun's future? Well, after a brief jaunt over to the Indies to do things like Ring of Honor and EC3's Control Your Narrative, he'd find a spot of luck coming his way when Triple H took over as head of creative for WWE in 2022. Yes, along with a number of other people, it would be at this point that the game invited Strowman back into the fold. And this was an offer he readily accepted as, from there, he immediately set about establishing himself on the Red brand. Would this lead to more world title success for him? Not exactly. Though it would see him hang around in the mid-card scene for a while as he feuded with the likes of Bronson Reed, Jacob Fatu, and Carmelo Hayes. That's right, by this point it was becoming clear that Braun's new role on the show was to act as a gatekeeper of the mid-card in many ways, helping to elevate some younger guys up to the next level. But the problem with such an idea was that the North Carolinian was already making a main eventer's salary. And that ultimately led to a situation where he'd be cut again in May of 2025 when TKO decided that what they were paying him was too much for them to justify. So as things stand right now then, Braun Strowman is one of those people who's been fired by WWE for a second time. Of course, none of this rules out a third run at some point down the line though. And even if this never happens, the big man status as someone who left and then went back to WWE still makes him eligible for today's video, just like everyone else we've looked at here.